just 2 minutes to talk with the students,
Okay.
and then I give the word to you, all right?
Okay.
Alô, meus caros estudantes, nós estamos hoje aqui encerrando a nossa atividade das aulas do professor Kellogg, e nós precisamos, depois, ainda no fim dessa aula, eu vou marcar com vocês uma conversa para nós fazermos uma espécie de avaliação do curso e dar algumas informações que são importantes para vocês. Então, muito obrigado, boa aula, e eu vou passar a palavra para o professor Kellogg. Kellogg, go ahead.
Good morning, and welcome to the 9th and final lecture in our series on democracy and social conflict, how we govern ourselves between elections. The answer to that has been summed up with a vision of pragmatism, a unique philosophy that looks beyond elections to the dynamics of social problems and their resolution. We have been pursuing John Dewey's quest for an organic democracy and its relation to morals and ethics. We have examined this through law as a system of normative inquiry. I said last week we would finish with the question of foundations. How do we justify the vision of pragmatism with its focus on social conflict? We discussed the challenge of fair and truthful conduct of disputes. Our foundations depend on that. Democracy cannot be successful without resolution of our disputes in a process consistent with the best practices of inquiry. Fair, full, and inclusive inquiry is the best hope for social freedom, the freedom of democratic change, the very freedom that is denied by those other two authors with whom we began, Kenneth Arrow and Friedrich Hayek. Arrow's theorem was based on fixed preferences, impossible to order by voting. Hayek saw social order as spontaneous, too complex to change by rational construction. Social freedom, freedom to change our social world, depends on human habits. Freedom requires that embedded habits be able to adjust and change. Can human habits change? How? I'll take you to a familiar passage from a familiar book that you all know by Charles Dickens, and the occasion is just 3 weeks away. "It's Christmas Day," said Scrooge to himself. "I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night." Scrooge was early at the office next morning. If he could only catch Bob Cratchit coming in late. And he did. Yes, he did it. Bob was a full 18 minutes late. Scrooge sat with his door wide open. "Hello," growled Scrooge in his usual way. "What do you mean by coming here at this time of day? I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer, and therefore I am going to raise your salary. A Merry Christmas, Bob." I use that passage not to get us ready for the holidays, but to raise a question relevant to our very unusual times. Scrooge is transformed, but how? He and we are creatures of habit. He was a creature of ugly habits, and suddenly in one night, he's a creature of good ones. How in the real world can moral habits be changed at all, much less overnight? Clearly, when there is a will, habits can be changed. Take the observation by Meryl Streep of the actor and director Mike Nichols, a Russian who came to American fame from Russian persecution. Streep said he was acting all the time. Right from the beginning, he was acting being an American. He was acting being a blonde. He was acting being confident. He was acting being the smartest person in the room. You have all these things that you want desperately to be real, and you live in them, and they become you. On the other hand, can moral habits get worse? And how widely can they spread? For this, I give you the remark by Aunt Lydia in Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, passing the dead bodies of alleged traitors to the state. Quote, "Ordinary is what you are used to. This may not seem ordinary to you now, but after a time it will." All this dramatizes the subject of moral transformation. Can morality be willfully changed? If so, how can it be changed? And can it be directed? Finally, how are we to know whether habit change is good or bad, positive or negative, holy or unholy? That question brings us to the question of justification. Socrates' question was directed at the so-called hard case, asking whether an act is holy because it is loved by the gods or loved by them because it is holy. Is law right by nature or by human enactment? Or, put another way, is law something separate and distinct from morals? This apparently simple yes or no question has been around for a long time. How do you answer it? What evidence is there? You might try carefully examining what you know about law in detail and see if it appears to have qualities that are associated with morals. What is characteristic of every law? You find them written down in legal codes or statutes. That makes it look like a discrete set of commands. Do this or don't do that, issued by some authority. Or you might call it a set of rights and duties. These approaches were taken by utilitarians in the 19th century. But questions arose like, if they are commands, by whom? What about conditional laws and conflicts? What about bad laws? And how about other legal texts like commentaries designed to clarify those supposed commands and what to do if they conflict? Or what if you have a hard case like Socrates and Euthyphro, where legal commands don't provide any clear answer? You might then define law as a set of authoritative texts or primary and secondary rules, as Herbert Hart did in his famous book, The Concept of Law, in 1961. This allowed Hart to maintain a hard boundary around law as a concept separate from morals, which I showed you with this diagram, law with a distinct hard boundary and morals on the outside. This is called legal positivism, and it remains today an influential theory of law. Hart viewed law as a text with words that were occasionally vague in their application. His famous example was the prohibition of vehicles in a public park. Does the word vehicle cover a bicycle or even a baby carriage? The case could be decided by judicial expansion or contraction of the limited area around the word, what Hart called a penumbra around the term vehicle. But this theory of vague language failed to satisfy critics, like the legal realists who claim that complicated cases, like Socrates' Euthyphro, lack any clear answer. The vehicle case is really a poor example. Socrates' crime is not one about vague words. The American philosopher Ronald Dworkin came along just a few years later, and he argued that you need moral principles to solve the difficult cases when the authoritative texts don't clear them up. But how did that work? Dworkin assumed that applying or interpreting principles is something that judges can do, but he admitted that the problem is not easy. It can get quite complex when there are several opposing interpretations that apply to a particular case. Different judges will bring different principles to bear. To defend his position, Dworkin invented a super judge whom he named Hercules to illustrate how such problems can and therefore should be resolved. Hercules is immensely wise and has full knowledge of legal sources, as well as institutional knowledge of how legal institutions should operate. From this vast knowledge, Hercules will construct the theory that best fits and justifies the law as a whole. Dworkin is claiming that the resources are available. It's just a matter of using them the correct way. Both Hart and Dworkin fail to recognize the possibility of radical uncertainty. They both assume that any legal problem, no matter how complex, can be settled from immediate recourse to the cognitive products currently available. It's like answers to any case are right now somewhere on the shelves of human knowledge, as if stored in a massive and complex warehouse, or perhaps in the digital cloud. That's why it takes a super judge to assemble them for an answer. Last week, we investigated the career of Justice Holmes, covering his early studies of British science and the influence of Francis Bacon and John Stuart Mill, and seeing how this influenced his practice as a judge. Recall that he added the continuum of legal inquiry to Mill's theory of induction. But this was done in a little-known essay of 1873. So there were and still are major aspects of Holmes' thinking that have been ignored or misinterpreted by scholars. They have failed to see his reconstruction of the empirical traditions of Francis Bacon and John Stuart Mill, and his addition of the continuum of inquiry to Mill's notion of induction by comparing entities, using immediate evidence like Hercules. They have failed to see that Holmes denies the existence of a warehouse of contemporary knowledge applicable to the difficult case when it concerns a problem that is not yet fully understood, and when it is actually caused by the clash of embedded habits habits that must adjust to resolve it. I emphasized the importance of Francis Bacon's concern for full and fair inquiry in science and law, based on repeated raw experience, and his opposition to taking refuge from continued inquiry in general propositions or what he called axioms. Remember, Dewey's empirical naturalism also emphasized the need to engage in full inquiry, not appeal to so-called absolute values. Holmes's addition of a continuum to the theory of law broke with any attempt to understand it on the basis of immediate evidence or language. He viewed contesting precedents as grounded in habitual action, beliefs which had been captured by legal language, sentences, and propositions. This language might not permit of easy reconciliation, but perhaps the underlying habits were flexible enough. The continuum leaves open the possibility that habits can be adjusted to resolve conflict. Now, this may not just mean the victory of one habit over another. It can instead mean convergence. Holmes used the example of adjoining landowners whose interests diverge with regard to constructing something on the boundary between them. What happens when one landowner wants to construct a wall or building at or close to the boundary with another? The other landowner, his use or her use may be impaired by that construction. Holmes observed that over time, the courts were able in England to construct a formula governing the height and configuration of new construction on or near a boundary. This required a complex process of adjusting habits and reasons. Construction can take many different forms, and boundaries as well as local conditions will vary from case to case. Opposing practices of different landowners must be fully known before new rules are adopted. Often, they must be adopted in incremental steps. This means that habits are adjusted incrementally rather than all or nothing. Opposing habits may yield and converge into new habits, like drivers yielding to cars already in the traffic circle. Courts and legislatures make similar adjustments all the time to resolve disputes among conflicting economic and property interests. The important thing to note is that this is often done in a series of judgments rather than constructing a formula from the initial dispute. Habits must be given time and space to adjust and converge toward new practices. The implication is that the difficult new case arises in an area of radical uncertainty, not accessible to immediate reasoning, no matter how large the warehouse of legal texts or existing practices are considered. Ronald Dworkin's theory is the dominant one in jurisprudence today, so I will take you through it. He argued that in every situation where people's legal rights are controversial, the best interpretation involves a right answer, that there always exists a right answer as a matter of law that the judge must somehow discover. He opposes the notion that judges have discretion, since the law as properly interpreted must and will give an answer. The correct method is illustrated by the metaphor of the super judge Hercules, who has full knowledge of all legal sources in institutions. He'll construct the theory that best fits and justifies the law as a whole. We might ask, precisely how its method is conceived to operate. He focuses on interpreting the case, the hard case, as a practice. He claimed that it takes place in 3 stages, consisting of identification of the practice, justification, and reform. In the first stage, the judge identifies the relevant rules and standards taken to provide the tentative content of the practice. The second stage is one of constructing a theory of why a practice of that general shape is worth pursuing. If it is, the judge must settle on some general justification for the main elements of the practice. Note here that Dworkin ignores the possibility that competing or conflicting practices might be involved. He says the judge must see himself as interpreting a single practice. Dworkin's notion that the right answer in a controversial case, requiring a judicial mind of Herculean ability, is the antithesis of Holmes's conception of a new case, which he called a case of first impression. Dworkin is overgeneralizing from discrete aspects of the early case in its still unknown continuum of inquiry. He is building an inclusive theory around the limited perspectives of an early situation, which is one of uncertainty, the real radical social uncertainty that we have emphasized. It is impossible to engage in final abstractions before induction is complete and all relevant facts are in. Holmes implied that they are never completely in. He said in 1873 that new cases will arise which will elude the most carefully constructed formula. Convergence, it should be remembered, is the successful outcome of an extended induction. And convergence cannot be achieved by cognitive and communicative activity alone. Dworkin's stages of interpretation are comparable to what might, under favorable conditions, take place over time in the hoped for convergence of Holmes's continuum of inquiry. His second or interpretive stage sounds like a further exploration of a situation putting the practice in its best light. This stage includes assessing the competing eligible theories to see which fits the data, which and has a unique quality which Dworkin calls moral appeal. But here, 2 distinct problems are elided. Competing eligible theories may represent competing practices and habits. If the sense of the situation is itself contested, then further experience and choices have to be encountered before it can be identified in its best light, as he says. The critical difference between Dworkin's stages in just one judicial inquiry and the many successive stages of Holmes is that although Dworkin describes them as stages, they are stages of only one immediate judgment. Now, there can, of course, be instances where a larger problem could be resolved at once in a single case. But there are many more that require time and wider experience, both of which are foreclosed even to the most omniscient judge by Dworkin. He relies too much on the lawyers who happen to represent the parties. He relies on the opposition of legal arguments, which he presumes can bring every relevant consideration to bear, ignoring the underlying conflicts that remain hidden and resistant to convergence. He talks of consensus, but his reliance on opposing arguments of counsel is not very participatory. It's not inclusive. The reasoning would still rely on the supremely unnatural powers of that mythical judge Hercules, capable not just of seeing any situation, but of articulating its consistency with the governing idea of integrity of the law as a whole. His argument from principle has never encountered strong resistance from the empirical tradition of Bacon and Mill. The overwhelming acceptance of his view among legal theorists of recourse to principle as an accepted practice of law implies that these principles that the lawyers refer to, even though vague and ill-defined, have a real and causal existence simply because the legal profession deploys them in legal advocacy. That view assumes that any difficult judgment underlying the determination of whether the law applies to an uncertain case is always in some degree deduction, not induction, as Holmes concluded in 1873. In Dworkin's method, judges' own moral judgment and political convictions are directly engaged. But the political judgments they make is complex and will set one view of political morality against another. Their decision will reflect not only their opinions about justice and fairness, but their own higher order convictions about how these ideals should be resolved when they compete. The social networks of judges and lawyers will always be insulated from the concerns of most of the population. Tradition and practice prevent having a representative from every minority, much less every major economic or social interest group represented in the courts, much less on the Supreme Court. Dworkin extends the rule of judicial reason to its absolute limit, incorporating moral and political theory into the realm of adjudication. How then can his theory be inconsistent with politicizing the rule of law? But this is where legal philosophy stands today. If you want to study and learn philosophy of law, the principal authorities are Herbert Hart and Ronald Dworkin. The problem is that it ignores the insights of Holmes and the empirical tradition of Bacon. It tends to favor, instead of limiting, the use of axiomatic thinking in the decision of cases, and it fails to provide a basis for social freedom, for resolving conflict by habit adjustment and change. Habits may converge in full and fair inquiry in law or in ethics. Legal inquiry is a formal model, but it reflects the nature of informal, non-legal inquiry. All ethical inquiry follows a continuum of experience and should, but may not, be grounded in the full and fair evaluation of that experience. John Dewey sought to bring this approach to ethics in general in his reference to empirical naturalism. This was misunderstood during his lifetime, and it continues to be misunderstood and ignored today. This brings me to another foundational problem within the tradition of pragmatism itself. Why is Dewey's empirical naturalism still ignored today? This revolves around the movement of philosophy during the last century toward analysis of language, which has included a movement away from experience as Dewey and Holmes conceived it. after his death in 1952, Dewey's voluminous writings were increasingly ignored, and his legacy was eclipsed by a combination of factors, including new political ideologies from the Cold War and the arrival of European philosophers to American universities. These philosophers brought analytical, logical positivism and linguistic philosophy to American philosophy. What Dewey had called the epistemology industry took over the profession with a technical style that rejected the concerns for human problems that Dewey had favored. Then, to the surprise of many philosophers now committed to analytic and linguistic methods, Richard Rorty brought Dewey back from academic exile. He did this in 1979 with the publication of Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. Rorty's book pronounced that Dewey was one of the three most important philosophers of his time. And I'll quote you what he says in that book. Three most important philosophers of the 20th century were Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and Dewey. Each tried in his early years to find a new way of making philosophy foundational, a new way of formulating an ultimate context for thought. Each of the three came to see his earlier effort as self-deceptive, as an attempt to retain a certain conception of philosophy after the notions needed to flesh out that conception had been discarded. Each of the three, and his later work, broke free of the Kantian conception of philosophy as foundational and spent his time warning against those very temptations to which he himself had once succumbed. Thus, their later work is therapeutic rather than constructive, edifying rather than systematic, designed to make the reader question his or her own motives for philosophizing rather than to supply him or her with a new philosophical program. They are all in agreement that the notion of knowledge as accurate representation, made possible by special mental processes and intelligible through a general theory of representation, needs to be abandoned. With the phrase mirror of nature, Rorty challenged what we might call the philosophical habit of representationalism. He expressed mistrust of the image of philosophy as a search for true and real knowledge, insisting that it is to be understood as an element of our cultural history, a kind of writing, a voice in the conversation of mankind. He opposed philosophy as an academic profession, with professionals working on technical questions inherited from the history of ideas. Now, from this, you can see that Rorty agreed with Dewey's mistrust of the epistemology industry, but he ignored most of the rest of Dewey. Rorty had become an expert on that extremely technical field as a younger philosopher. But this was not all good news for Dewey's advocates. In rejecting epistemology, he also rejected Dewey's reliance on the notion of human experience. For followers of Dewey, this was throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Why did Rorty do this? We will need some technical background to understand it. Epistemology refers to a venerable tradition of philosophy, of understanding the source of knowledge, going back to Plato and Aristotle. whether we can have real knowledge at all, and if so, how. This implies that we begin with a condition of radical doubt. Doubt about everything knowable. Otherwise, we wouldn't be aware of the question. The great doubter was the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes, who claimed to emerge from radical doubt with the conclusion, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Note that the Cartesian doubt about knowledge is all or none. It is directed at the general question, not assuming that there already is knowledge of some things and not of others. This unitary focus has been the chief one for philosophy, leading eventually to Richard Rorty's argument for rejecting the whole project. It is also an important source of relativism. If your doubt is general and you can't buy into Descartes or any foundations, nothing is sure. This epistemic world of foundations is not a dappled world with some areas of stability and others of uncertainty, but is the dappled world an epistemic one? What foundations does the dappled world have? I think the whole point of Dewey's pragmatism is to find foundations in the full and fair continuum of inquiry. Dewey saw regarding ethics that the universal all-encompassing doubt leads through relativism to appeals to authority and force, the dangerous, counterproductive appeal to so-called absolute values. But his continuum of inquiry does not lead there. It leads to knowledge through experience. So why did Rorty reject experience? Here's the technical part. I'll try to keep it simple. Traditional epistemology assumed that knowledge is hierarchically structured, like a building or a pyramid. At the bottom, there must be some cognitive states in direct contact with reality or with the ground, like sense perceptions that serve as a firm foundation on which the rest of our knowledge is built by various inferential methods. This foundationalist picture of knowledge is largely based on Descartes and the later 17th century English philosopher John Locke. It imposes two requirements on knowledge. One, there must be cognitive states that are basic in the sense that they possess some positive epistemic status, something independent of their relations to any other cognitive states. Every non-basic cognitive state, everything above ground, so to speak, can possess positive epistemic status only because of the epistemic relations it bears directly or indirectly to basic cognitive states. Thus, the basic states must provide the ultimate support for the rest of our knowledge. This is the picture of epistemology that Rorty first learned, adopted, and then rejected from analytical philosophy. If you have been following me for 8 weeks now, you should already have guessed what I am about to say about it. It's based on a static flash camera picture of reality. We might compare it to the problem of foundations in legal theory. It attempts to decide the difficult case from immediate knowledge rather than a process of transformation based on the past, but looking toward the future, and always responsive to further future experience. Rorty's pragmatism, or neo-pragmatism, as his followers have been called, have failed to see Dewey's view of problematic doubt in the continuum of inquiry, where knowledge comes in increments, in stages. I don't think Dewey was clear and emphatic about this, but in particular about how ethical knowledge is formed from the experience of conflict. For that, we turn to the thought and career of Justice Holmes and to his contribution to the understanding of the continuum of inquiry through conflict. So how and why did Rorty reject Dewey's experience? As I say, it grew out of a reaction against the history of philosophical foundationalism, the obsession that led Descartes to the cogito. Here, Rorty turned to an argument about basic cognitive states by the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars. Those basic, independent, and efficacious cognitive states would be what Sellars characterized as a mythological given. Many philosophers have believed that there has to be such a given if there is to be any knowledge at all. Descartes claimed that his act of thinking was a given, which obviously deflated scientific facts and Bacon's empiricism. And this opened up a long-standing divide between English and continental philosophy. So next, Sellars argued that all inferential relations, or basic thought processes, are always between items with propositional form, like snow is white, grass is green. And therefore, non-propositional items, such as sense data, are epistemically inefficacious and cannot serve as what is given. He's saying essentially that you do not get knowledge from seeing or touching. It has to be put into propositions and sentences. In technical lingo, get this, no inferentially acquired, propositionally structured mental state is epistemically independent. This is breaking the connection between sensation and ideas inherited from John Locke. It is saying that Locke's account of knowledge does not stand up to careful examination. Examination of multiple candidates for non-inferentially acquired, propositionally structured cognitive states, that is, stuff on the higher part of the pyramid, indicates that their epistemic status presupposes the possession by the knowing subject of other empirical knowledge. The bottom line is, since every cognition is either propositionally structured or not, no item of empirical knowledge can serve as the function of a given. There you have the famous myth of the given. And if you can repeat this in technical language, you will have no problem getting admission to any graduate school. I recognize that this sounds like some difficult philosophical jargon, but it boils down to the idea that cognitive states are fundamentally semantic or language-based. It's an idea that has now invaded almost all of analytic philosophy, including pragmatism. It is applied even to Dewey's idea of experience, which is drawn from the tradition of British empiricism. It simply says that Dewey's idea of experience is just another failed candidate for non-inferentially acquired, propositionally structured cognitive states. What then is the answer? It lies in pragmatism's vision of the world of knowledge. Let's remember the previous lecture concerning particularism and generalism, in which we asked, how is moral knowledge possible? Analytical philosophy looked at the immediate situation and drew the extreme particularist conclusion that it could not be cashed out in propositional terms. In order to work, it must be communicated, as science communicates natural knowledge. But I pointed out that such knowledge is formulated in propositional terms in the course of resolving social conflicts. This essentially says to Sellers and Rorty that language does not precede experience, but disputes about experience precede language. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any knowledge at all. I also pointed out earlier that much of our contemporary propositional knowledge that we consider to be stable and reliable is based on previous disagreements that have been resolved over time. This fact is very easy to ignore because we see language as an encyclopedia of current knowledge. For example, how about commonly accepted propositions like grass is green or snow is white? It's easy to ignore that those propositions came from earlier dispute. How do such propositions come into being? Do they emanate from a single mind or some universal mind? In order to be stable, they must once have been contested, and they still may be contested. A keen observer will observe that some grass is blue, or that all grass is brown after exposed to a hot sun. And snow takes on many colors by reflection or mixture and discoloration. Therefore, as I said 2 weeks ago, the shape of all propositions is to be found in the social response to discrete problems. This is the dappled world of a pluralist landscape of patterns and propositions. I said if this were not the case, there would be no current communicable and actionable moral knowledge of any kind. So the dappled world is also an epistemic world with utterly different foundations from the analytical world. To summarize, the neo-pragmatism of Rorty applied Sellers's myth of the given to John Dewey's account of experience. The argument was that all experience is expressed in language, and then it cannot provide independent and efficacious evidence for knowledge. If knowledge is propositional, it has no direct connection to anything given. Rorty rejected Dewey's notion of experience as an internal world that functions as the basis and guarantee of cognitive processes. He claimed that instead there is nothing more than language, and language is coextensive with reality. And that brought us to the epistemic importance of conflict. Its successful resolution constantly creates the very fundamental foundations of our human world. Greenness and whiteness, grassiness and snowness, all are products of contested propositions, just as we have seen with legal and ethical rules. What is a proposition but an attempt toward final communication? Certainly, every legal proposition is contested by definition. Is law experience? Is the polarization experience? If all knowledge is propositional, then keep in mind that every proposition can be contested, and that survival and stability is the test of justified knowledge. Propositions are critical to communication. But there's more to knowledge than communication. And here is where Rorty and neo-pragmatism fail. They fail to see the critical importance of the potential for transformation. If there's no getting outside our beliefs and language, knowledge is tied to indeterminacy, ambiguity, uncertainty, and even randomness. It is tied to what Rorty called a vocabulary. As he describes it, the choice of a vocabulary is always contingent or dependent on a cultural history. He doesn't deny that a vocabulary involves acquired habits. It is but a vocabulary is informed by metaphors that can correspond to cognitive and moral habits. The pivotal feature is the notion of a final vocabulary. That would be each person's web of beliefs, behaviors, and desires that are the result of a series of contingent factors, such as family and school, education, cultural tradition, and linguistic style. All these local elements end up in our final vocabularies, according to Rorty. However, this emphasis on language leaves little room for a theory of habit adjustment and transformation in the context of social dispute and conflict. The only mechanism that Rorty finds available for reform and change is one that he calls irony. This is the ability of an ironist or an ironical person to contemplate other vocabularies. And I'll quote from Rorty here. I shall define an ironist as someone who fulfills three conditions. One, she has radical and continuing doubts about the final vocabulary she currently uses because she has been impressed by other vocabularies taken as final by people or books she has encountered. Two, she realizes that argument phrased in present vocabulary can neither underwrite nor dissolve these doubts. Three, insofar as she philosophizes about her situation, she does not think that her vocabulary is closer to reality than others, that it is in touch with a power not herself. End quote. What then was Rorty's attitude toward the difficulties confronting human society? Given his commitment to language, Rorty naturally emphasizes the importance of enhancing communicative practices. This would empower natural human feelings of solidarity and their ability to counter what he calls oppression and cruelty. For Rorty, solidarity is a collaborative trait of culture and science, and the notions of truth and meaning that structure the social sharing of values, methods, and purpose. At the same time, openness to cultural differences and to the needs of others, especially, as he says, those who have fallen victim to humiliation and suffering. That's a long quote from Rorty, which I see as completely naive, especially today. He would have difficulty, wouldn't he, in explaining the polarization, the great polarization? He would have difficulty explaining the vocabulary of climate denial, of race and gender superiority. He would have difficulty explaining the vocabulary of bullying, the middle school children in Kawakami's novel Heaven. For Miko Kawakami, clearly, philosophy is a habit. Kawakami brought bullying into focus with her recent novel Heaven, about the two children in middle school severely beaten by older boys, and looking to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche to understand their situation. Is bullying a habit? How does bullying relate to other habits like racism, sexism, health, climate, religious worship? I think Kawakami is asking a bigger question. Is Nietzsche a habit that we should be concerned about? And the same for relativism. Is relativism a bad habit? The choice is between a good or bad philosophy. Dewey's philosophy is a better philosophical habit, certainly a better one than Nietzsche's in respect of relativism. It's a habit focusing on problems rather than on what Dewey called the epistemology industry. Why is it disregarded by neo-pragmatists? Rorty's approach to philosophy as a continuing conversation is explained by him in another passage. I am accused, he says, of being an end of philosophy thinker. Philosophy is not the sort of thing that can have an end. It is too vague and amorphous to bear the weight of predications like beginning or end. What does have a beginning and now may be coming to an end is 300 years of attempts to bridge the gap which Cartesian representationalist picture of knowledge and inquiry lead us to imagine has existed. The only point on which I would insist, says Rorty, is that philosophers' moral concern should be with continuing the conversation of the West, rather than insisting on a place for the traditional problems of philosophy within that conversation. So if philosophy is merely conversation, where then is any possibility for transformation through adjustment of habits? John Dewey brought us to see the hidden continuum through which society either meets its challenges or fails to do so. This is the moral continuum. Scrooge's transformation on Christmas Eve ignores the continuum. Think about your own habits today. Are they changing with the pandemic? How much do you act differently, think differently, speak differently? There is much evidence that now is one of the greatest periods of habit, conflict, and change in many years, perhaps many decades. Yet, there is hope. Our studies of law indicate that habits are adjusted incrementally. They are forced by individual conflicts into individual adjustments. Take, for example, the conflict over assisted death since 1999 and the prosecution of Dr. Kevorkian. The problem has reached a tentative, if also moving, consensus that allows in some places for assisted death under certain specified conditions. Conflict is even now forcing habit change regarding pandemic illnesses, environmental protection, and the treatment of the powerless by the powerful. It seems to me that this is the crisis underlying our great polarization, what I would call our normative crisis. It's largely a crisis of habits, not just individual, but corporate habits. In Scrooge's case, Dickens had to make up an enormous shock. In the real world, even with repeated great shocks, habits persist with powerful pushback. The Me Too movement against sexual aggression and bullying followed a series of shocking revelations and then fell headlong into the political arena. Will it eventually modify habits and intuitions? How will that work? Shocks add up, and even literature such as Kawakami's novel Heaven has an effect. We can gain insight from legal history into morals in general. Morals are a patchwork of emerging smaller problems, and the danger is in failing to address the specific problems on their own terms. Ideology and polarization is itself a problem, perhaps greater than the specific issues. One way to look at our unusual time is to step back and ask, what is the nature of the concrete problems that our countries face, and how resistant are they to convergence. For all of them, we have the necessary knowledge for their resolution. My purpose in explaining pragmatism and its advantage over analytical philosophy has been to prepare you as a new generation of problem solvers. Now, we've reached the end of the hour, but I would like to mention that we are coming up on a very important birthday, and that's the birthday of Professor George, which I believe is coming up in about a week. Is that right, Professor George?
Yes, Kellogg, yes.
So we have dedicated these lectures to you, Professor George, and you have been instrumental in bringing pragmatism and John Dewey to Brazil. And your accomplishments over the course of your career are all secondary to your personal accomplishments and your originality and your example. And so we all wish you a very happy birthday in a very short period of time.
Okay, Kellogg, I don't have words to respond to you, but we cannot imagine how emotional was for me receiving this kind of gift as a precious gift of my birthday.
Good. Happy birthday, and I will talk to you again soon.
Okay, and estudantes, por favor, o professor Kellogg acaba de encerrar a sua brilhante exposição desse curso rápido, mas profundo, e nós precisamos agora, para concluir esse belíssimo trabalho, ter um rapport, ter uma conversa com vocês sobre ele, uma espécie de avaliação, algumas questões que vocês precisem colocar para nós e questões que nós precisamos colocar para vocês. Então, eu tinha programado aqui com o professor Pedro e nós nos encontrarmos na próxima segunda-feira, às 10 horas, para fazermos, assim, em torno de 1 hora, mais ou menos, esse bate-papo que é fundamental para que nós encerremos, esclareçamos as dúvidas que, porventura, restaram nesse belíssimo encontro que nós tivemos durante esse período de 10 aulas semanais. Eu espero que todos vocês participem na próxima segunda-feira. Eu quero só dizer da importância disso, que eu considero como importante isso aí. Eu estarei viajando para Portugal, onde vou passar um período de até janeiro do próximo ano. Inclusive, eu vou fazer um curso e dar um curso. E também minha mulher vai fazer o doutoramento. Mas eu não poderia deixar de escolher essa oportunidade exatamente no dia que coincide o dia da nossa atividade. Para vocês, não é sacrifício, para mim é um prazer, é uma honra conversar com vocês na próxima segunda, que à noite eu estarei tomando um avião para ir para Lisboa. Um grande abraço a todos, muito grato pela atenção que dispensaram, e eu os espero na próxima segunda-feira. Pedro quer dizer alguma coisa? Pedro, uma das recomendações, também está ansioso para recebê-los. Até a próxima segunda-feira. Um grande abraço.